Charlie, can you describe how you changed acts?
All right. The differences in Acts are much less than they are in the Gospels, because in the Gospels I was blending four together. You couldn't have the same chapters and verses. I had to invent new chapters and verses. But for Acts, I use exactly the same traditional chapters and verses, but sometimes I blended a few verses together, or sometimes I would overlap a chapter a little bit. I used the same chapter number that traditionals do, but it wasn't obvious that you had changed chapters until you got to the end of the topic. There is also, at the end of Acts, a section where Luke talks about various trips Paul made by ship. And Luke describes those trips in detail. A lot of names of places, a lot of names of people. And I moved all of that information into the glossary where you could still get it, no problem, but you didn't need to stumble over all of those names in getting the message. You could get the message easily.
That seems reasonable. So how did the letters change?
All right. Like Acts, chapters and verses can still be the same, and I followed the traditional numbers. No big deal. Like Acts, I blended some of the verses, and I overlapped some of the chapters occasionally. No big deal. The big change for the letters is, in your traditional translation of the New Testament, you've got two groups of letters. The first group is Paul's letters, and they are arranged by order of size, not by chronology, not by when he wrote them. So the longest one comes first, and the shortest one comes last, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Then the second group is all the other letters. They are arranged by size, so the longest one comes first, and the shortest one comes last. Once again, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So in my translation, I grouped them all into one group and said, now let's put them in chronological order so that as you read them, you get a feel for what's changing in the environment. And strangely enough, what I learned to my surprise was that James came before any of Paul's letters. Now, the other letters came pretty much after Paul, and that just made it easy to group Paul's letters together so you could see the flow of his ideas and the things he was having to deal with.
Did you rearrange anything else?
Well, there is one place in 1 Corinthians where Paul talked about the Lord's Supper. Some call it communion, Eucharist, different names, but anyhow, whatever you call it, in chapter 10 he talks about it, and in chapter 11 he talks about it, but there's some things he covers in between those two sections. And so I took that chapter 11 section and moved it back next to chapter 10 so that you could get the whole story about the Lord. Now, I kept the chapter and verse numbers the same, but I wanted you to be able to get the whole story about the Lord's Supper in one reading, and then show chapter 11 starting with verse 1 and 11. Yeah, fine. But the parts that are hooked to chapter 10 had higher verse numbers. It's easy to read. We've been talking about the 21st century New Testament. That New Testament is drastically different in every shape possible and still carry exactly the same message that was intended from the very beginning, without some of the traditions that were not intended in the beginning. To find out more about that translation, I urge you to go to a website, ncm-21.com. There you'll find more information about this New Testament. You'll find lots of information about how the New Testament helps, and you'll find links to where you can buy it, and you'll find the complete glossary, which is a good read all on its own. I had one lady who told me that she stopped reading the New Testament and started reading the glossary and couldn't go back to the New Testament until she finished reading the glossary. Then she went back to the New Testament. But I want you to really get the history and the culture that will help you understand who they were writing about, how they wrote, what they wrote. Get the whole story.